The gasoline pooled at the foot of the stairs, soaking into the Persian rug as Julian's accomplice flicked open his Zippo lighter. Upstairs, Sarah heard the metallic scratch of the flame catching. Downstairs, in the garage, Elias woke to find his entire fortune already stolen, transferred to an offshore account while his hands were zip-tied to a pillar. And in the bedroom where Sarah had spent the morning locked behind an oak door, the smell of accelerant was creeping under the frame like a living thing. It had all started 6 days earlier, on a Wednesday evening when the rain came. Elias pulled open the heavy oak front door. A gust of damp air entered the house, carrying with it the smell of wet stone and distant traffic. Julian stood on the porch, a single battered leather suitcase in his left hand, a rain-spattered wool coat draped over his arm. His face was thin, almost hollow, the kind of face that belonged to someone who had spent time away from sunlight. "Good God, Julian, you're soaked. Get in here before the hallway floods," Elias said, his smile wide and genuine. He was a man who enjoyed being needed, and the phone call from Julian that afternoon, a voice from 20 years ago, tired and asking for help, had activated something in him. Charity, rescue, the kind of generosity that felt good to extend. Julian stepped onto the polished cherry wood floor with careful movements. He looked down at his muddy boots and hesitated, then removed them slowly, placing them neatly on the antique Persian rug. Sarah appeared at the end of the hallway, wiping her hands on a white apron. Her expression was the kind of neutral that women learn to perfect, polite but measuring, welcoming but wary. "I'm so sorry for the intrusion, Sarah," Julian said, his voice soft and apologetic. "Elias is too kind for his own good." Elias clapped Julian on the shoulder with a heavy thud that would have sent a lesser man stumbling. He led them into the living room, where a fire was crackling in the stone fireplace. Julian sat on the edge of the cream-colored velvet sofa, looking out of place in his damp clothes, his posture somehow both relaxed and coiled. The posture of someone accustomed to appraising rooms for exits. "Nonsense," Elias said, spreading his hands with the expansive gesture of a man who had never known want. "The spare room has been empty for years. Stay as long as you need to get your business back on track." Sarah set a tray of tea on the coffee table. As she leaned down, Julian's hand moved, seemingly by accident, knocking a small framed photo off the side table. It hit the floor with a sharp crack, and the glass spiderwebbed across the image of Elias and Sarah on their honeymoon, his face now severed by a crooked line of breakage. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Julian said, his voice breathless with theatrical shock. "I'm terribly sorry. It's the fatigue." Elias picked up the photo without expression, glancing at the damaged glass for only a moment before tossing it into the wastepaper basket by his desk. It landed with a hollow thud. Sarah watched the photograph disappear, her hands trembling slightly behind her back. When she looked up, Julian was already sipping his tea, a faint, almost invisible smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. That night, Sarah lay awake in bed beside Elias, listening to him snore with the complete unconsciousness of a man who had no reason to doubt anyone or anything. She tried to remember if Elias had ever mentioned Julian before. He hadn't, not once in 8 years of marriage. By 11:30 that night, Elias couldn't sleep either. He went downstairs and found himself drawn to the basement gym, a room he used sporadically, a space that had collected dust and his own good intentions. When he descended the wooden stairs in gray sweatpants and a white t-shirt, he found Julian standing by the heavy punching bag, barefoot despite the concrete floor's chill. Julian was hitting it with rhythmic, professional-style strikes. Each impact was precise, controlled, the kind of movement that came from training, not just anger. "Can't sleep either?" Elias asked, attempting levity. He moved into a playful boxing stance and threw a slow-motion jab at Julian's shoulder. Julian reacted instantly, ducking low and sweeping Elias's lead leg with practiced efficiency. Elias fell. What should have been an embarrassing moment became something else entirely when Julian grabbed his forearm, twisted it behind his back, and pinned him face down against the cold concrete floor. His left arm wrapped around Elias's neck in a chokehold that squeezed with precision. Not wild strength, but calibrated pressure. Elias gasped for air. His eyes bulged. His vision began to darken at the edges. After 3 seconds, Julian released him. He stood up and offered a hand, his face morphing back into a gentle smile. Elias stayed on the floor for a moment, rubbing his throat, which was already developing red marks. When he finally accepted the hand, his confusion was visible. The kind of confusion that comes when reality doesn't match expectations. "My God, Elias," Julian said, feigned panic in his voice, high-pitched and apologetic. Instinct took over. Old training habits, you know? "I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me." Elias believed him. This was the beginning of his troubles, though he wouldn't understand it as such for days. The next afternoon, while Julian was out for a walk, Sarah entered the guest room with a stack of fresh white towels. She set them on the pine dresser, her eyes immediately drawn to the leather suitcase tucked under the bed. She told herself she was being paranoid. She was also kneeling on the floor, pulling the suitcase out before she finished the thought. It was locked with a small brass padlock. She reached into the back of the closet, searching blindly among the visitor's items until her fingers found a small black moleskin notebook hidden inside a rolled-up pair of gray wool socks. Her hands were shaking as she opened it to the middle. The page was filled with a list of Elias's bank accounts, his daily schedule, and Sarah's own medication list. The pharmaceutical names were underlined in red. At the top of the page, written in bold red ink, were the words, "Target Acquisition Phase 2. Below that, in smaller print, Elias Miller, account Armvoron2X. PIN Auro82. Business account 1.2 manners. Sarah's mental history, anxiety, depression, previous hospitalization, 2015. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She flipped to the front of the book. Taped to the first page was a photograph of Julian standing next to a man she didn't recognize. A man with a distinctive scar running from his left eye to his jaw. Both men were smiling the kind of smile you make for prison photos. The date on the back of the photograph said, 2019, Federal Correctional Complex. She heard the front door slam downstairs. Her heart went into overdrive. She frantically shoved the notebook back into the socks, threw the socks into the closet, and stood up, smoothing her skirt as footsteps approached the stairs. Heavy boots. Step, step, step. They passed her in the hallway without stopping. That evening, as the sun was setting and the city lights were beginning to flicker on outside, Julian sat in a leather armchair across from Elias's desk in the home office. He held a glass of amber scotch. Elias was staring at a computer screen, looking stressed in the way of men who weren't accustomed to stress, the blue light from the monitor reflected in his tired eyes. "Elias," Julian said, his voice dripping with sympathy. "I hate to bring this up, but I found Sarah in my room earlier. She was confused, looking for things that weren't there." Elias spun his chair around, his frown deepening. "Confused. She's been a bit stressed lately, but that's all." Julian pulled a small white pill out of his pocket, one of Sarah's anti-anxiety medications. He placed it carefully on the green leather desk blotter. The tiny clack of it hitting the surface seemed to echo in the quiet room. "I found this on the floor of the hallway," Julian said, his voice dropping lower, more conspiratorial. She told me she stopped taking these weeks ago. Elias, she's hiding things. I think she's been seeing someone else. Elias stared at the pill. His hand slowly closed into a fist on the desk. He looked at a framed photo of Sarah on his desk, not the broken one, but another from better times. His face hardened, the muscles tightening, his eyes turning cold. Julian stood up and walked behind Elias, placing his hands on his shoulders. He could see the computer screen from this angle, the bank statements with their declining balance, the recent transfers that shouldn't have been there. Julian looked at the numbers and allowed himself a thin smile that Elias couldn't see. "Don't worry, brother," Julian said, falsely comforting. "I'm here. We'll handle this. Together." Late that night, as the moon was rising over the neighborhood and casting silver light across the kitchen tiles, Sarah found herself standing alone in the kitchen. She was holding a chef's knife and a green apple. Julian entered through the side door, moving silently, stopping just inches behind her, close enough that she could smell his cologne and something else underneath it, something animal. "Careful with that, Sarah," he whispered mockingly. "You're quite clumsy when you're agitated." Sarah spun around, pointing the knife at his chest. She was trembling, and her face was wet with tears that had come without her noticing they were there. "I know who you are," she said, her voice hysterical but low. "I saw the notebook. I saw the prison photo. Get out of my house." Julian's hand flashed out, grabbing her wrist with bone-crushing force. He twisted her arm, making her drop the knife. It clattered loudly on the tile. He slammed her back against the marble island with enough force that the air left her lungs. Pain exploded across her shoulder blades. Sarah brought her knee up sharply into his groin. Julian grunted, his grip loosening just enough. She shoved him away and grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the drying rack, swinging it at his head with all the desperate strength of someone who had just realized she was fighting for her life. The skillet connected with a loud clang that grazed Julian's temple. He stumbled back into the breakfast nook table, knocking over a chair. The green apple rolled across the floor, disappearing into shadow. Julian wiped blood from a small cut on his forehead. He stood up, his eyes turning murderous, the fake gentleness completely gone. He was about to lunge again when Elias's voice boomed from the stairs. "Sarah, what the hell is going on down there?" Elias stood in the kitchen doorway, wearing a navy blue bathrobe, his confusion giving way rapidly to horror as he took in the scene. Sarah was still holding the skillet, breathing hard. Julian was on the floor, bleeding, his hand pressed to his temple. But his expression had shifted again, his eyes now wet and fearful, his body language that of a man who had just been brutally attacked. "I just caught her," Julian said, his voice whimpering, his hand trembling. "She was talking to herself, Elias, about your bank accounts. When I asked her if she was okay, she just..." The next morning, as the gray overcast sky pressed down on the neighborhood, Elias stood by the bedroom door with his suitcase already packed. Sarah was sitting on the bed, her wrists red and raw from trying to open the window, from trying to do anything that might escape this room where she was imprisoned. "Julian is taking me to the bank to fix the damage you did," Elias said, his voice emotionless and robotic. The voice of a man doing a grim task he'd already convinced himself was necessary. "Then he's calling the doctor. You aren't well, Sarah. Stay here." The door clicked shut behind him. Sarah rushed to the wood and hammered on it with both fists until her knuckles bled, until her voice was hoarse from screaming. The sound echoed in the room, but went nowhere. Down in the hallway, Julian was waiting by the front door. He was holding Elias's car keys and wearing black leather gloves that he hadn't had when he arrived. He smiled as Elias descended the stairs. The smile of a man who was exactly where he needed to be. On his wrist was a gold Rolex watch. Expensive, valuable, and definitely not something that belonged to a man who had supposedly been struggling. In the garage, Elias reached for the door button. As he turned his back to Julian pulled a weighted leather sap from his jacket and swung it into the back of Elias's head with clinical precision. The wet thwack of leather against skull was followed by the immediate collapse of Elias's body. His suitcase fell over and spilled across the concrete floor. Julian caught him before he hit the floor and dragged him toward the metal workbench. He began to tie Elias's hands behind a support pillar using heavy plastic zip ties. The sound of them cinching tight was almost quiet, almost professional. Elias's head hung low, blood dripping onto his white collar and soaking into the fabric. Julian reached into Elias's pocket and pulled out his phone. He used Elias's limp finger to unlock it via biometric sensor. He navigated to the banking app with the kind of ease that suggested he'd studied how to do this. The phone screen showed a $1.2 million balance in the main business account. Julian examined it like a jeweler examining a stone. The door to the garage swung open. The scarred man from the prison photo entered, carrying a red plastic gasoline canister. He was grinning, his scarred tissue pulling his face into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Right on time, Julian," the scarred man said, his voice gravelly and menacing. "Is the wife upstairs?" Julian pulled out a legal document, a power of attorney form. It was already been signed with Elias's signature, forged with perfect precision. He tapped it against his chin, examining his handiwork. "She's waiting for her scheduled accident," Julian said, his voice cold and professional, the voice of a businessman closing a deal. "Let's finish the transfer first." Upstairs, in the master bedroom, Sarah was sitting on the floor by the radiator. She heard the sound of liquid splashing against the hallway carpet. The smell of gasoline began to seep under the bedroom door like a living thing, creeping through the gap at the bottom, filling her lungs. The glug, glug, glug of the gas can continued as she pressed her back against the radiator. She found a small nail file in her vanity, something she'd forgotten to put away, and held it like it was a weapon, though it was barely longer than her pinky finger. A dark stain was appearing at the bottom of the white bedroom door, spreading like a shadow. Down in the garage, Julian turned the laptop screen toward the unconscious Elias, though the gesture was really for his own benefit. The screen showed the transaction history. The balance was now 0.00. The funds had been moved to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, disappearing into electronic void the way money does when it's being stolen properly. Julian allowed himself a moment to appreciate his own work. Then he smiled widely, the smile of a man who had solved an equation that others would have found impossible. "You were so easy, Elias," he said to the unconscious man, his voice pure vitriol. "You wanted a friend, and I wanted a retirement. Sarah will be the tragic cause of the fire. Mental breakdown leads to house fire. It's poetic." Back in the bedroom, Sarah was on her knees at the door. She had the thin metal nail file jammed into the keyhole. She was twisting it, sweat dripping from her nose, her face a mask of fierce concentration. The metal scraped against metal with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard, but it was working. The lock mechanism was shifting. There was a loud click. The door swung open. The hallway was soaked in gasoline, reeking of it, the fumes so thick she could taste them on her tongue. At the far end of the hall, the scarred man was pulling a Zippo lighter from his pocket. He hadn't noticed her yet. He was looking at the small flame, watching it flicker to life, admiring the blue and orange of it. Sarah didn't scream. She grabbed the heavy ceramic vase from the hallway stand and hurled it at the man's head with all her strength. The vase whistled through the air and shattered against his temple with a sound like a melon hitting concrete. The scarred man dropped to the floor, the Zippo falling from his limp hand and skittering across the soaked carpet. Sarah ran down the stairs, her bare feet slapping against the wood. She didn't think. She moved. She burst into the garage through the side door, and Julian looked up from closing his laptop, his shock genuine for the first time since he'd arrived at the house. Sarah grabbed a heavy pipe wrench from the tool wall and swung. She screamed as she did it, a war cry, a sound of pure survival instinct. Julian duckled. The wrench hit the laptop and shattered the screen into a spiderweb of broken electronics. He lunged at Sarah, grabbing her hair, pulling her head back. She dropped the wrench and gouged her nails into his eyes with the kind of desperation that comes from knowing you might die. Her fingers clawed at his face. Julian howled in pain. With Julian distracted, Elias managed to use a sharp edge of the workbench to fray his zip ties. He snapped the weakened plastic and lunged forward, tackling Julian from behind. The three of them hit the floor, Sarah landing on top of Julian, then Elias landing on top of them both, grappling on the oily concrete in a tangle of limbs and fury. Elias delivered a massive right hook to Julian's jaw. Julian's head snapped back, connecting with the side of the BMW with enough force to crack the metal. He went limp, his eyes rolling back, his breathing becoming shallow. Silence fell in the garage, except for their ragged breathing. The police arrived within 20 minutes. Fire trucks came with them, their lights painting the driveway in alternating red and blue. Julian and his accomplice were being led away in handcuffs, the scarred man still dazed from the vase, blood running down his face. Julian's eyes kept flicking toward Sarah with a look that was almost hateful, the look of a man whose plan had failed. Sarah and Elias stood on the driveway as the emergency vehicles surrounded the house. Elias was wrapped in a shock blanket. Sarah was holding his hand, and his hand was trembling. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Elias whispered, his voice broken. "I lost everything. The money. It's all gone." He sent it to the Caymans. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver USB drive. She held it up to the light, and it gleamed. "I knew you'd trust him more than me," Sarah said, her voice sharp and intelligent in a way it hadn't been in days. "So, when I found that bank transfer he showed you, I didn't just cry. I changed the routing software on your laptop before the fight in the kitchen." She showed him the screen of her own phone. It displayed a notification from an encrypted crypto wallet. The message was simple. Credit, $200,000. Status, secure. "He didn't send the money to the Caymans, Elias," Sarah said, her voice witty and dry despite everything. "He sent it to me. And now, I think it's time we get a different guest room. Specifically, one without doors that lock from the outside." Elias pulled Sarah into a tight hug. She rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes watching Julian being shoved into the back of a police car. When Julian looked toward the house one more time, Sarah gave him one final, cold wink through the car window. Then the car door slammed shut, and the vehicle pulled away from the house, taking Julian into whatever came next. The Miller house stood tall against the horizon, the emergency lights still flickering across its face, the smell of gasoline still hanging in the air. But inside, the danger had passed.